This is B.F. Skinner, The Technology of Teaching. Can't really read the title that well. Chapter 6, Teaching Thinking. My voice is a little gruff. I don't know if I'll be able to read this well. Well, whatever. It's about 30 pages long. So let's get started. The early history of programmed instruction has led to some misunderstanding. And I don't know what programmed instruction means. I think that programmed instruction is what B.F. Skinner was advocating, which is that you have like a computer teaching the person. So the early history of programmed instruction has led to some misunderstanding. Programming has been most quickly adopted in industry, where objectives can be clearly defined and methods easily changed, and where the resulting gains, often expressed in dollars and cents, naturally lead to administrative action. My voice is not very good. In schools, colleges, and graduate schools, it is much more difficult to define goals and to change practices, and gains from improvement are often too vague or remote to affect administrators. The more rapid adoption by industry has suggested that the scope of programmed instruction is limited, and the conclusion seems to be confirmed by the fact that most of the programs suitable for school or college use are designed either to transmit verbal knowledge or to develop basic motor and perceptual skills. And I wish he gave examples, because he's being abstract there. He's probably drawing on a bunch of examples he can think of, but I don't know the examples he's talking about there. So let me read that sentence again. The more rapid adoption by industry has suggested that and when he says industry, he means non-school stuff. So, if Coca-Cola was using this program to teach their employees something, that would be an example of industry as opposed to education. The more rapid adoption by industry has suggested that the scope of programmed instruction is limited, and the conclusion seems to be confirmed by the fact that most of the programs suitable for school or college use are designed either to transmit verbal knowledge or to develop basic motor and perceptual skills. These are the subjects most often taught, and for practical and commercial reasons, programs have been constructed to teach them. The emphasis comes from the educational establishment, not from the nature of programming, but programming has suffered from guilt by association. It is widely believed that it is useful only in the transmission of knowledge and simple skills. So that's the end of that paragraph. If I was going to summarize the main idea of that paragraph, I would say the first sentence, it summarizes the main idea. The first sentence says, the early history of programmed instruction has led to some misunderstanding. And I think also the last sentence is also the main idea. It is widely believed that programmed instruction is useful only in the transmission of knowledge and simple skills. And then his explanation is in the middle. So the middle of it is an explanation of those main ideas. Man, my voice is in really bad shape. All right, next paragraph. Some critics have gone further. They have argued that its very success works against the attainment of special objectives. So the very success of program instruction works against the attainment of special objectives, and I'm not sure what he means by special objectives. So I think I'm going to circle anything where I don't know exactly what he's referring to. So I'm going to go back to the other page and circle verbal knowledge. I'll write down examples, because I needed examples for that, but he didn't provide them. So some critics have gone further. They have argued that the very success of programmed instruction works against the attainment of special objectives. If traditional methods are less efficient in teaching some things, it is because they are designed to teach other things as well, things which are not only out of reach of programmed instruction, but somehow threatened by it. Any kind of effective teaching can be criticized in this way. The student who is well taught has no opportunity to learn how to learn, an opportunity enjoyed by those who are badly taught or not taught at all. That's pretty funny. So I think that's a bit of a wisecrack on his part. So I think the main point he's making there is that critics are saying that by using programmed instruction, you miss out on other things that the other method uses. And B.F. Skinner's point is that that's not a big deal. It doesn't, so what, they can learn it in another way. And that you could always make that criticism about anything, any kind of effective teaching. So every problem solved with the help of a teacher is one problem less for the student to learn how to solve by himself. The more successfully the teacher spreads knowledge before the student as terra cognita, the fewer the chances to learn to explore the unknown. So I think when he says terra cognita, I think he means that, he means that that is known information. In full possession of conclusions reached and decisions taken, he has no chance to learn how to conclude or decide. The better his acquaintance with the established methods and views of others, the poorer his opportunity to be original or creative. If there is any one word for what seems to be missing when teaching is too successful, it is the chance to learn to think. I think that is a main idea there. And I think those previous sentences were examples. So I think the middle of that paragraph is just a bunch of examples. And I think another phrasing of the main idea in that paragraph is that the student who is well taught has no opportunity to learn how to learn. So, new paragraph. It is important that the student should learn without being taught. It is important that the student should learn without being taught, solve problems by himself, explore the unknown, make decisions, and behave in original ways. And these activities should, if possible, be taught. But when? The traditional strategy has been to teach thinking while teaching subject matter, and some sort of conflict is then inevitable. Instruction designed simply to transmit what is already known has often neglected the teaching of thinking. Some recent reforms have swung to the other extreme. In making sure that the student learns how to think, they neglect the transmission of what is known. It may appear that the problem is to find some sort of balance, but only if the assignments are carried out at the same time. If thinking can be analyzed and taught separately, the already known can be transmitted with maximal efficiency. I think I'm going to... That seems like a main idea right there. So that's the end of that paragraph. And I think the main idea of that paragraph is that there are two things that you need to teach people when you're as students. You need to teach them both general information, like how to use a hammer, and then you also need to teach them how to solve new problems that you are not going to give them the answer to. And that's kind of like a maze-solving algorithm. When you're in this situation, this is how you should react. And so what B.F. Skinner is saying is that traditionally those two things were taught at the same time. And what he is suggesting is that you may be able to break them apart and teach them separately, and then each could be taught as efficiently as possible. So, new paragraph. This alternative, which I just described, has not been thoroughly explored because it is not compatible with traditional views of thinking. When we say that we want students to think, what do we really want them to do? It is as important to define the terminal behavior in teaching thinking as in teaching knowledge. So the terminal behavior means the behavior that you want the student to have. The terminal means at the end, the goal. So it is as important to define the terminal behavior in teaching thinking as in teaching knowledge. How can it be done? The traditional view is that thinking is an obscure, intellectual, cognitive activity, something which goes on in the mind and requires the use of rational powers and faculties. It leads to action when the thoughts to which it gives rise are expressed, but it is not itself behavior. It can sometimes be observed by the thinker, but it can also be unconscious, and introspective accounts are therefore not very consistent or helpful. Outstanding instances of thinking seem especially likely to arise from obscure intuitions or insights, and great thinkers seldom have great thoughts about thinking. This is particularly unfortunate because thinking in this sense is never observed by anyone except the thinker. If we believe that others think as we do, it is only because we arrive at the same expressed conclusions, given the same public premises. So that's the end of that paragraph. So I think the main idea of that paragraph is the first sentence. The traditional view is that thinking is an obscure, intellectual, cognitive activity. And I think that the previous paragraph, which was a short one, is a main question which is now being answered. So the main question is, what do we really want to do when we say that we want to teach them how to think? And that's why he went into this new paragraph in which he explained the traditional way of thinking about what it means to think. So defined, as in the previous paragraph, as this obscure thing, if it's defined like that, thinking is hard to study. Cognitive psychologists tend to confine themselves to the structure of expressed thoughts. So that means something that you said, as opposed to something that you did not say. To the outcomes of thinking, rather than thinking itself. The variables to which structure is most commonly related cannot be manipulated. Let me pause there. The variables to which structure is most commonly related cannot be manipulated. I'm not sure what he means by structure there. Well, he uses structure in the previous sentence when he's talking about the structure of expressed thoughts. I'm not sure what he means by structure. The variables to which structure is most commonly related cannot be manipulated. Time is perhaps the best example. The products of various cognitive activities are studied as a function of age, as in the work of Piaget. The products of various cognitive activities are studied as a function of age, as in the work of Piaget. The investigator can then turn from the shadowy processes of thinking to the conspicuous processes of development and growth. Sex, race, cultural history, and personality are other variables which are said to affect thinking in this sense, but which are either uncontrollable or not substantially controlled in the research at hand. So I think the main idea there is the first sentence. When you define thinking as this obscure intellectual cognitive activity, it's hard to study. I don't have quite as strong a grasp on that paragraph as I would like, but I think I have a rough idea what he's saying. So, new paragraph. Those who study thinking experimentally may not suffer greatly from the limitations imposed by variables of this sort, but that is not true of the teacher. He needs to control his conditions. He can take little satisfaction in simply waiting for his students to grow older. He cannot change their sex or race, and their personalities and cultural histories are practically out of reach. How, then, can he bring about the changes in behavior which are said to show that his students are learning to think? Possessing no clear-cut description of the behavior he is to set up, and having no apparent access to controllable variables, he is forced back upon the notion of exercise. He sets problems to be solved and reinforces the student when he solves them, or punishes him when he does not. In this way, he quote, strengthens rational powers in a sort of intellectual muscle building. So, I think the main idea is that the teacher needs to control his conditions. So, how can he change how can he bring about the changes? And then I think it says that the teacher goes to this idea of exercise. So he's saying that basically that the behavior of teachers nowadays, or at the time he wrote this, of using this kind of exercise idea, is a result of the lack of clear thinking about what exactly they're trying to do in the students. No clear-cut description of the behavior he is to set up, and no apparent access to controllable variables. I think I want to underline that. Those two things. No clear-cut description of the behavior he is to set up is the first thing, and no apparent access to controllable variables. He may go somewhat further by arranging, so this is a new paragraph, he may go somewhat further by arranging tasks in order of increasing difficulty. The student strengthens his mental muscles on an easy problem before moving on to a harder one. This rudimentary programming is possible because it does not require any knowledge of thinking. One might teach high jumping with the same technique, setting the bar at a given height, inducing the student to jump, and moving the bar up or down as the outcome dictates. It is not necessary to know anything about jumping. The student will learn to clear the bar at a respectable height, but he will almost certainly not jump well, for he cannot profit from what others have learned about good form. Interesting analogy. Similarly, I'm not even sure that's an analogy, it's just an example. Similarly, a student may learn to think when the teacher simply poses problems and reinforces solutions, but he will almost always think inefficiently, so not efficiently, rather than with the good form which others have discovered before him. That's a great example. I'm going to put a big exclamation point, because that's a great, that's an easy to remember analogy right there. I'm going to remember that one. So, new paragraph. Exercising rational powers is a sink or swim technique, and it is no more successful in teaching thinking than in teaching swimming. If we throw a lot of children into a pool, some of them will manage to get to the edge and climb out. We may claim to have taught them to swim, although most of them swim badly. Others go to the bottom, and we rescue them. We do not see those who go to the bottom when we teach thinking, and many of those who survive think badly. The method does not teach. It simply selects those who learn without being taught. Selection is always more wasteful than instruction, and is especially harmful when it takes its place. The last part of that sentence caught me off guard. I wasn't sure what that meant. Selection is always more wasteful than instruction, and is especially harmful when selection takes the place of instruction. I don't know why it's especially harmful. Schools and colleges have come to rely more and more on selecting students who do not need to be taught, and in doing so they have come to pay less and less attention to teaching. Among current proposals for reform, programmed instruction is almost unique in focusing on the learning process and in suggesting practices which actually teach rather than select those who learn without being taught. The issue is crucial in teaching thinking. So I think the main idea of that paragraph is the first sentence, that exercising rational powers is a sink or swim technique, and it is no more successful in teaching thinking than in teaching swimming. So again, the main idea is that this method does not teach, it simply selects those who learn without being taught. And then another main idea is at the bottom when he says that programmed instruction is almost unique in focusing on the learning process among current proposals for reform. Okay, so the new paragraph. The good high jumping coach is less concerned with whether the bar is cleared than with form or style. Clearing the bar usually sustains good form in an accomplished jumper, but it produces it only by accident. Special reinforcers must be made contingent on the topography of the behavior rather than its outcome. Well, that's interesting. Special reinforcers must be made contingent on the topography of the behavior rather than its outcome. Only under rare circumstances will the ultimate advantages of thinking teach a student to think. The teacher must arrange effective contingencies which respect the topography of thinking. Scientific help is needed. Research on the structure of expressed thoughts, relevant perhaps to evaluating the outcomes of thinking. Research on the structure of expressed thoughts, relevant perhaps to evaluating the outcomes of thinking, has little to say about techniques. I don't know what he means by the structure of expressed thoughts. I don't know what that is. A more helpful formulation can be derived from the experimental analysis of behavior. End of paragraph. So I think that the main idea is the first couple sentences, that they're less concerned with the outcome than with the form or style. A lot of poker players, good poker players, say that is what he just said there is crucial when you're trying to get good at poker, is that you have to learn, same with blackjack, You have to learn to separate the outcome of any particular hand from your evaluation of whether you are playing correctly. You have to learn to play according to a style or according to an algorithm that you have determined will help you win. And you have to stick with that even when you have a losing streak. You have to trust that you have the right method. So that's very interesting. And so what he's saying here is that you have to have special contingencies. You cannot rely on the natural outcomes of behavior to supply the reinforcement, to supply the positive result that will get people to learn that good behavior. So in other words, learning that masterful blackjack technique wouldn't just arise naturally out of someone playing blackjack, but to teach someone how to play that way, you need to have special reinforcement, special rewards that will reward someone when they're playing correctly according to the algorithm, and you cannot rely simply on whether or not they are winning every hand. That's very interesting. Okay, so that's the first part of this chapter. Now there's a subheading, Thinking as Behavior. So thinking as behavior. Oh yeah, and you can see all my notes. You can see how I write all over the page. Very useful when you want to refer to it later. Man, my vocal cords are in bad shape. All right, thinking as behavior. Quote, to think often means simply to behave. In this sense, we are said to think verbally or non-verbally, mathematically, musically, socially, politically, and so on. In a slightly different sense, it means to behave with respect to stimuli. Well, I mean, the first sentence is a little bit vague for me. To think means to behave. I'm not sure what he means by behave in that sense. In a slightly different sense, it means to behave with respect to stimuli. A man may think it is raining when he has been wet by a lawn sprinkler beyond a hedge. Oh, so he's saying a man may think, so he's using the word think there. A man may think it is raining when he has been wet by a lawn sprinkler beyond a hedge. No special problem arises in teaching the repertoires which are exhibited as we think in either of these senses. So I think the main idea of that's the end of that paragraph. So I think the main idea there is that to think means to behave, and I think there he's revealing a particular understanding of what behave means. So new paragraph. Thinking is also identified with certain behavioral processes, such as learning, discriminating, generalizing, and abstracting. These are not behavior, but changes in behavior. There is no action, mental or otherwise. When we teach a child to press a button by reinforcing his response with candy, it adds nothing to say that he then responds because he knows, he quote, knows that pressing the button will produce candy. When we teach him to press a red button but not a green, when we teach him to press a red button but not a green button, it adds nothing to say that he now, quote, discriminates or, quote, tells the difference between red and green. When we teach him to press a red button and then discover that he will press an orange button as well, though with a lower probability, it adds nothing to say that he has, quote, generalized from one color to another. When we bring the response under the control of a single property of stimuli, what does that mean? When we bring the response, I guess that means pressing the button, when we bring the response under the control of a single property of stimuli, I guess that means the color, it adds nothing to say that the child has formed an, quote, abstraction. So I guess that means that yeah, so I guess what he's saying there is if you give a kid candy every time he presses a red switch of any kind, any different types of switches, and the kid knows that it's always has to be the red switch that will produce the candy, would be that would be an example of bringing that response of flicking the switch under the control of a single property of stimuli. In that case, the stimuli would be the type of switch present, the type of switch that you show to the child, and the single property would be the color. So it would be the red switch that would be pressed. So that would be an example of that. Man. So B.F. Skinner is saying if you do that, it adds nothing to say that the child has formed a, quote, abstraction. We bring about the changes which define processes of these sort. We bring about the changes which define processes of these sort, but we do not teach the processes, and no special techniques are needed to teach thinking in this sense. So now I'm trying, that's the end of that paragraph. I'm trying to figure out what the main idea is. So I'll reread the beginning. Thinking is also identified with certain behavioral processes, such as learning, discriminating, generalizing, and abstracting. These are not behavior, but changes in behavior. There is no action, mental or otherwise. So I think what he's saying in this paragraph is that traditionally, if you were running a school, what you would say is that you want to teach the students how to learn. You'd want to teach the students how to discriminate between things, like how to, pick things out. Not in the sense of, racial discrimination. You'd want to teach the student how to generalize from specific cases. And you'd say that you want to teach the student how to abstract from general cases. So what I think B.F. Skinner is saying is that those things, abstracting, generalizing, discriminating, those things are not things that need to be taught, because they're not really, they don't really refer to things that people do. They refer to changes in what people are doing. And I think what he's saying is that that process of changing is not itself what needs to be taught. I think that's what he's saying. He says, we bring about the changes which define processes of these sort, but we do not teach the processes, and no special techniques are needed to teach thinking in this sense. We do not teach the processes. So I think what he's saying is that to get a student to abstract, you don't need to teach them how to abstract. You just produce changes in their environment which naturally have them abstract. I'm not sure if I'm explaining this very well. I think that's what he's saying there. So I think the main idea he's saying here is that there are certain things that have been traditionally emphasized as being needed to be taught, and he's saying that they don't necessarily need to be taught in and of themselves, or at least they don't need to be focused on as a thing in themselves. I'm not totally sure. So, new paragraph. Certain kinds of behavior traditionally identified with thinking must, however, be analyzed and taught as such. So I think that sentence confirms what I was thinking with the previous paragraph, that those processes do not need to be analyzed and taught as such. So in this new paragraph he says, certain kinds of behavior traditionally identified with thinking must, however, be analyzed and taught as such. Some parts of our behavior alter and improve the effectiveness of other parts in what may be called intellectual self-management. Some parts of our behavior alter and improve the effectiveness of other parts in what may be called intellectual self-management. So he continues, faced with a situation in which no effective behavior is available, in which we cannot emit a response which is likely to be reinforced. So in parentheses he had defined what he means by no effective behavior is available. Some water. So when he says no effective behavior is available, what he means is that we cannot emit a response which is likely to be reinforced. So faced with a situation like this, we behave in ways which make effective behavior possible. And then in parentheses he says, we improve our chances of reinforcement. In doing so, technically speaking, we execute a, quote, precurrent response which changes either our environment or ourselves in such a way that a, quote, consumatory behavior occurs. For a more detailed analysis, see 46. I guess that's something in the references. Let's see, references 46. So it's a B.F. Skinner, it's his book, Science and Human Behavior. That's a book that he wrote in 1953. Well, he's being very abstract there, very vague. I wish he had given an example. Well, that's the end of that section. That section was called Thinking as Behavior. And now there is a new section called Attending. And he begins. A rather simple example of precurrent behavior which illustrates the difference between leaving the student to discover techniques for himself and giving him instruction in self-management, is attention. So attention is the example. If we were to respond with the same speed and energy to every aspect of the world around us, we should be hopelessly confused. We must respond only to selected features. But how are they selected? Why do we look at one thing rather than another? How do we observe the shape of an object while paying no attention to its color? What is happening when we listen only to the cello in a recorded string quartet? That's a very good question. What is happening when we listen only to the cello in a recorded string quartet? What is happening, I guess, in your brain? So that's the end of that paragraph. I honestly don't know what he's talking about. I don't know where he's going with this. I'll reread the beginning. A rather simple example of precurrent behavior, which illustrates the difference between leaving the student to discover techniques for himself and giving him instruction in self-management, is attention. I don't know where he's going with this. Okay, so new paragraph. Some selective mechanisms are, of course, genetic. We respond only to those energies which affect our receptors, and even though we possess both sensitive eyes and ears, we may nevertheless be, quote, ear-minded or, quote, eye-minded. Some stimuli elicit or release reflex or instinctive responses, as when we are alerted by a loud or unusual noise. Stimuli of this sort are used to get attention. The teacher induces the student to look at an object by isolating it from other attention-getting things, or by showing it suddenly or moving it about. He induces him to listen to what he is saying by speaking loudly or varying his speed or intonation. So-called audio-visual materials, for example, brightly colored textbooks and animated films, are made attractive on the same principles. None of this teaches the student to pay attention, and it may actually make him less likely to pay attention to things which are not on their face interesting. The student can be induced to act selectively to special features of the environment by arranging contingencies of reinforcement. Roughly speaking, he can be taught that some features of the environment are, quote, worth responding to. The central process is discrimination, and instruction consists simply in arranging appropriate contingencies. And he says in parentheses, when we appear to short-circuit the process by pointing to a stimulus or otherwise calling attention to it, we are actually taking advantage of similar, if more complex, contingencies in the student's history. There is no special problem in teaching the student to pay attention in this sense. I honestly don't exactly know what he's talking about. I'm going to continue and hope that later paragraphs will make it clear. And if not, I'll return to those paragraphs and give them a second look and see if I can figure them out. I honestly don't think I'll be able to get to the end of this chapter now. My voice is in pretty bad shape. To attend to something as a form of self-management is to respond to it in such a way that subsequent To attend to something as a form of self-management is to respond to it in such a way that subsequent behavior is more likely to be reinforced. I see. I think I understand what he's saying there. I think that's the main idea right there. I'll read that again. To attend to something as a form of self-management is to respond to it in such a way that subsequent behavior is more likely to be reinforced. The precurrent behavior may be learned or unlearned. When we turn our eyes toward an object and focus upon it, or sniff an odor, or move a liquid about on the tongue, or slide our fingers over a surface, we make a stimulus more effective. There are two stages. 1. Attending to a given state of affairs, and 2. Responding to it in some other way. In the normal course of events, the reinforcement of the second stage strengthens the first. One second. Yeah, I think I may only get halfway or less than halfway through this. If I can get to page 30. Still quite far. So, new paragraph. In sink or swim instruction, reinforcement is also contingent on the second stage. We set tasks which demand attention and reinforce the student when he is successful, or punish him when he is not, presumably because he has or has not paid attention. He is left to discover how to pay attention for himself. The method often works. A child can be taught to match colors with the device shown in figure 13. Where's figure 13? A child can be taught to match colors with the device shown in figure 13 if he is reinforced when he presses the panel, which is of the same color as the sample panel. He must, of course, look at the sample. He will probably learn to do so. He will probably learn to do so if he is reinforced when he presses the matching panel and mildly punished when he presses other panels. But a better technique is to teach the precurrent behavior directly. For example, if the machine requires him to press, let me show you a picture of what it looks like first. Yeah. So here's a picture. So that's the device he's talking about. It's just like a color matching machine. So I'll start over now that you've seen that. A child can be taught to match colors with the device shown in Figure 13 if he is reinforced when he presses the panel, which is of the same color as the sample panel. He must, of course, look at the sample. He will probably learn to do so if he is reinforced when he presses the matching panel and mildly punished when he presses other panels. But a better technique is to teach the precurrent behavior directly, and the precurrent behavior in this case is looking at the sample. For example, if the machine requires him to press the sample panel before the other panels are illuminated, looking at the sample in the act of pressing it will be immediately reinforced by the illumination of the other panels. We achieve the same result when we warn a child to stop and look when he starts to respond without having done so. Interesting. Okay, so the main idea, that's the end of that paragraph. And I think the main idea of that is that traditionally, when you have these two-step processes, they reinforce the second step. And B.S. Skinner is saying it's more effective to reinforce the first step directly. So, new paragraph. And while I'm reading this, I'm thinking about video games and how you could make more effective video games that would use this idea, and also hopefully teach people something more useful than what the video games teach people right now. 1 minute. In a simple example of this sort, the gain from direct instruction may not be great. But some techniques of attending to a stimulus are learned only slowly, if at all, when reinforcement is confined to the second stage. So some techniques of attending to a stimulus are learned only slowly, if at all, when reinforcement is confined to the second stage. So I think he gives an example. So for example, very few people learn to look slightly to one side of an object in order to respond to it more effectively in night vision, unless they are specifically taught to do so. Specific contingencies may be needed to teach a baseball batter to, quote, keep his eye on the ball, particularly because natural contingencies are opposed to the behavior. It is dangerous to look at a ball at the moment of impact, and the flight of the ball a moment later is the principal reinforcing consequence. So I think the flight of the ball means once you hit it. So that's the natural contingency. The natural contingency is the natural reinforcement would be seeing the ball flying after you've hit it, but that only appears after you have overcome the aversive feeling of, not wanting to look at the baseball. So simply reinforcing a child when he reads a text correctly may be much less effective than special contingencies which induce him to read from left to right. Or to read a block of words at a glance. Another way to attend to stimuli so that one may respond to them more effectively is to construct supplemental stimuli. We do this when we point to words we are reading, or follow a voice in a recorded fugue by singing or beating time with it, or by moving our eyes along a score. Techniques of this sort are not likely to be learned simply because behavior which presupposes them is reinforced. And new paragraph. In short, much of the elaborate art of looking and listening cannot be taught simply by reinforcing the student when he responds in ways which show that he has previously looked and listened carefully. Direct instruction is needed. Interesting. So I think the main idea of that bigger paragraph is that some techniques of attending to a stimulus are learned slowly, if at all, when reinforcement is confined to the second stage. And then he gives a whole bunch of examples. The one that got me a little confused was simply reinforcing a child when he reads a text correctly may be much less effective than special contingencies which induce him to read from left to right, or to read a block of words at a glance. So I think what he's saying there is that reinforcing a child when he reads, if you reward a child when he reads a text correctly, that may be too big of a jump for a child. You may have to reward them for making smaller jumps of progress. All right. Trying to think if I want to do the next two sections or just take a break now. My voice is in really bad shape. I think I'm going to stop now and pick up again when my voice feels better. This is a very interesting chapter, though.